Big bonfires were burning beside almost every town and village during the times known as Reformation. Thanks to those fires, the old books, in which the genuine history of humanity was recorded, was erased. Few small groups of Jesuit monks made copies of those old books, and on those copies is based what you have learned in school during the history lessons. Sadly, your history teacher forgot to mention a very small detail that the monks honestly wrote in their books, that they are not making exact copies, but they are actually copying and correcting the text so that it will fit the most modern for their times and new idea of what history was. And that's why the content of the official history doesn't fit the artifacts and the historic sites. This so-called history didn't come as a result of scientific research or something recorded in the old chronicles. It was imposed with military power, aided by extreme cruelty. For those who are not satisfied with this imaginary history, here in this video I will make an attempt to make a new timeline of the history of our planet based on the actual artifacts and historic sites that we have at hand, instead of speculations or so-called old books. Contrary to common spread beliefs, sophistication, technology, and everything else that we tend to label as advanced or civilized is nothing that evolved recently within the last couple of thousand years, but it was probably always there on Earth, coming and going away at different locations at different times, like the waves of the ocean. And that is why machine parts show up in very ancient layers, like for example these spirals, they clearly bear marks of machine work. Or for example, this imprint of what nowadays we would call an airplane wheel was found almost a kilometer deep below the Earth's surface in coal layers, which according to the official mainstream geology should be some 300 million years old. The day after this amazing find was made in the Donetsk area of Ukraine, the full mine was submerged in water and closed down. We are lucky to have these images because a worker took them with his cell phone. In US as well, concrete wall was found very deep in the earth layers, and I believe again on the very next day the full mine was closed down and filled up with boulders. But speaking in terms of actually accessible ruins dating from those faraway times of extreme antiquity, probably most of them would be already unrecognizable due to the prolonged erosion. Like for example these stones from Sweden, it is hard to say, are they ruins of something or a natural formation? The oldest surviving ruins we have are those of rock-cut underground dwellings that are found all over the southern parts of Asia and Europe, and to some extent both Americas. These rock-cut cities are so vast, especially in the region of Asia Minor, that we don't know, were they designed to support many millions of people of population, or we can talk even about billions. In many regions of nowadays Turkey, there is a similar ruin almost next to every town and village. Although most of these dwellings appear to be primitive, especially because they are so heavily eroded and because chisel marks are often seen on them, still the civilization that dug them out was in no way primitive. For example, at the bell-shaped, gigantic grottos in Israel, the tool marks that appear on the very high ceilings appear, according to some people who have studied them, to be machine-like. And then in Spain I noticed these curious maybe tool marks on the floor. Possibly some tool was used to scoop out the stone, because very similar marks are found also in Peru. This is from Peru, this is from Egypt, and then very similar in Russia. But no matter what kind of tools were used, engineering and building all these underground networks, sometimes multi-floored, is not something that could be done by primitive people. Just look at these complexes of giant holes. Savages who have never seen a comb in their life cannot design and carry out projects of this magnitude, as mainstream penguins often try to assure us. And that's when they are kind enough to even accept them as man-made, as they did in this particular case with the grottos of Polignano. It is not uncommon for them to simply put a sign, interesting geological formation, and in such a clever fashion to avoid even discussing them. But by far the most common trick used to distract the public attention from this amazing network of rock-cut cities, metropolises, is to give the credit of building them to the cultures that were reusing them throughout history. For example, this would be listed as some sort of Christian church, without mentioning a word that it is located in a complex, extremely ancient complex. Another way to make the common people unaware of the existence of this almost worldwide network of cities is to make up fantasy names, often absolutely fraudulent and misleading ones, but always different for the different regions. For example, in Hungary, they are telling, oh, somebody must have been breeding bees in them. Israel and Turkey was supposedly full of villagers who were breeding pigeons in them. In Spain, the monks were supposedly building them to meditate in them. And in the area of the Balkans, they are called Thracian altars. And people believe all this because they are shown only a very small fragment of information, only the local one. They are not being informed that there is a uniform worldwide network of cities of uniform style, which happens to be extremely ancient. Ruins of this style are found submerged as low as 80 meters below sea level. And lots of the ruins bear no connection with the current earth level. On the floors of some of them, we see petrified formations that are usually found at the bottoms of oceans and seas, where the sediments petrify after very long periods of time. Sometimes vertical columns that are found inside the rooms of these underground cities, in rooms that are not directly exposed to outside weather, even those columns are so heavily worn out by the elements that only hints are left from them. At a number of places, the very geological layers of the earth have been moving and shifting after these cities were built. They are much older than anything built, all the monuments from the last few thousand years, which are more or less near the current Earth level. Don't just believe me, think for yourself what kind of earthquake would have been needed to flip this size of boulders. It is highly preposterous and even laughable on the side of the penguins to try to convince the public that this has been cut in the rock in the last 1 or 2,000 years. And then in certain areas of Turkey, in the vicinity of the rock-cut very ancient cities, there are extremely ancient vehicle tracks. Whether the rock-cut cities and the vehicle tracks are connected is yet to be found out, but one thing is sure, these tracks were left in the soft mud. These images are the ultimate proof. And they are imprints of lots of activity going on besides the tracks. Lots of activity, but not a single human or animal footprint. So it is time to admit that basically we have very little, even general clue what was going on our planet in deep antiquity. And just to avoid misunderstanding, not all ancient tracks were left at the same time period, and not all of them were left in soft mud. For example, these tracks are obviously on a paved road and are surprisingly sharp as well. And then we have the tips of the giant castles of Egil sticking out of the waters. For me, those are some of the most remarkable historic sites on Earth due to their extreme age. What portion of them is underwater, we don't even know. But they give us a rare glimpse of the towers of buildings built many thousands of years ago. I think that is absolutely amazing. Since the title of this video reads timeline, probably many of you would be expecting more years in terms of suggested information of how old all this could be. But in reality, if we have to be honest, we don't have even a single reliable historic or geological method of dating all this. And then at the site of Illyros, Greece, we have a similar cone-shaped maybe roof again sticking out. Inside it's got a chamber. Taken separately, this is neither extremely exciting nor very meaningful. But once we make the parallel that this resembles exactly, actually it repeats exactly the shape of the roofs of the castles of Egil, then we can start making the hypothesis that this was the architectural outside style of this absolutely enormous network of underground cities. Another site that may give us a valuable clue as of the looks, the external architectural looks of these complexes is Yalantash. It is hard to say though if the animal figures belong to the original, very first rock-cut cities here, or they were a result of the subsequent renovations and remodeling attempts. Yes, the situation with the rock-cut cities is extremely complicated. For example, those in Turkey, they were initially built by people of our size and later on used by dwarves and who knows whom exactly. And in Crimea, we have even a more interesting situation. Over there, we have completely distinct two generations of underground city building with vast gap in between them in terms of time. I don't know what that vast gap would be in reality, but if we trust the mainstream geological dating, that gap could be even number of millions of years. Well, I don't trust it, but sometimes I quote it just to give a general relative idea. And speaking of the really oldest historical remains, in this very same area, maybe we have samples of the oldest pieces of art. I dare to suggest such a hypothesis because near Avila in Spain, again in the vicinity of an area very rich in ruins of ancient rock-cut cities, we have the bulls of Avila. So in both cases, the statues are in proximity with rock-cut complexes. In both cases, they are very, very eroded, and in both cases, they don't fit in the subsequent art styles of the cultures present after that. At this point, you might wonder, what about those small statues that they were showing us in school, telling us that they are the oldest form of art found on Earth? Their age also looks very impressive, more than 30,000 years. First of all, we don't have that much reliable dating method to be sure that they are dated properly. And second, if we assume that these dates are correct, then this would be simply the oldest examples of simple or primitive tribal art, which is a nice style. I mean, people make such things even nowadays. That's nothing new. But what is unfortunate is that when sophisticated and very old pieces of art are found, they cannot be examined and categorized properly by the penguins, because the penguins also have some sort of penguin knowledge and experience, simply because they will not fit in the fairy tales that they are preaching, and that is the best case scenario. Probably the most interesting pieces of art simply disappear before people even get to know about them. It is normal to have very old artifacts with simple tribal art. Even now, tribes exist in the remote regions, in the jungles. The problem is that when you tell only half of the story, eventually it turns into a lie because it hides the existence of other, more advanced segments of society on our planet. The proof is not only their ancient depictions, like this one from the Marquesa Islands, but also the fact that we regularly find buildings, structures, and artifacts that have required advanced technology to make. In many cases, even technology that surpasses our current level of so-called advancement. Here we have a depiction of green race from Siberia. And it's not just the high-tech artifacts, also the maps, the old maps made with digital accuracy depicting the continents as they were found a very long time ago. For example, Antarctica without ice sheet. If the human race wants to know its true origin, first of all, it should stop considering the legends, fantasies of simple people. The legends are our history. They are confirmed by the artifacts, and also they are found in very similar versions on different continents, which is yet another confirmation that they are not made up, they are not fantasy, they are just common man's record of our past. Try to calculate yourself what would be the mathematical chance of simple folks living separately, not connected to each other, in America, in Egypt, in Asia, in Europe, all of them to have the same dream, same fantasy, that some sort of strange beings land from the stars or come out from the ocean and they're half human, half amphibian or something like that, and then to have the exact same fantasy that they mate with them, and even the end of their fantasy is always the same. The offsprings, the result of such unions, they always become the rulers of their kingdoms. And on the top of that, the simple man who had absolutely the same fantasy, although they were separated by oceans, which they supposedly could not cross, and then they decided to make this fantasy their historic record, respected by their tribe. Well, I think the chances are somewhere around zero. There are just too many similarities to call all this coincidence. The legends are confirmed by the artifacts. We find skulls that are not human. For example, this elongated skull from Bolivia, it has a completely different design. It's not just what they call human deformation. It's an entirely different thing. Also, recent DNA tests of elongated skulls, this time from Paracas in Peru, they have shown non-human origin. So before even discussing any particular historic events, one should first get right at the basics. That the human race has been interacting with beings from other spheres all the time, and that has influenced our historic development profoundly. Or to be more precise, they have simply shaped our history. And probably the second oldest type or class of ruins would be the so-called elf castles. They are also primarily rock cut and heavily eroded like the underground cities, but they are connected to the current earth level. They are found all over Asia Minor and Southern Europe. Without any doubt, they belong to a single civilization or culture. For example, look at these stone niches. One is on the Balkans and the other one in Germany. As if the same stone mason cut both of them, or people looking at the same architectural projects cut them. Even small details like the size of the border in the front, they match. And also the rectangular cuttings inside, they're also practically identical. Even the borders I see are again of uniform size. Officially, they were cut by stupid villagers who didn't know anything that is more far away than the tip of their own nose, but to speak of traveling or connecting to the people on other continents. And this is just a small example. Actually, all the other architectural and design elements, they're absolutely identical all the way from Israel to Portugal. Countless rectangular cuttings with sizes starting from half a meter and reaching, I don't know, maybe even 20 or 50 meters. With identical borders, they're just found by hundreds, if not thousands, all over West Asia and Southern Europe. Officially, they are always attributed to various mutually unconnected primitive tribes on various continents, but the sophistication of these castles shows that they are not the work of primitive people, and the design similarity shows that they were a product of a single cultural civilization. And although they are primarily rock cut, we start noticing the tendency of megalithic blocks to be used. Sometimes they're rather large, bigger than trees. It's not sure were they quarried or were they cast out of geopolymer, because sometimes we see the blocks connecting with each other in a funny fashion, like here for example. But we see this tendency to use megalithic blocks in the better preserved ones, the better preserved elf castles. The last few examples were from Turkey. Actually, there are a couple of videos on my channel about the elf castles specifically, highly recommended.
And also add Peppercorn. The whole thing is rock cut in large boulders, but when carefully examined, these large boulders are actually megalithic blocks. Now notice the grid on the floor. This is where the blocks meet.
Actually, the megalithic blocks here are so big that the people who live in a tiny matchbox-size universe of reality, who have confined themselves to such a small world view, they simply cannot not see them. They just see the medieval tower on the side, and then they are told that the rest is mystery, and everything gets dated because of one single tower which is indeed in medieval style, but the large metropolis-sized complex around with absolutely huge megalithic blocks. What about that? Well, that simply remains under the radar because of the extreme erosion and the unshakable belief that school history is science. And here we are back to Turkey, where the megalithic blocks were somewhat more obvious, but look at the floor. Same, it looks like the floor of Perpericon. Megalithic blocks the size of rooms. And then one of the numerous elf castles in Spain, Santa Cruz de la Sierra, the megalithic blocks are also visible here. This site in Armenia could easily also belong to the same group. Why not? We see similar gigantic size, same style, polygonal masonry, and of course nobody knows anything about it. Despite the stage of deterioration of the elf castles, still we can say for sure they were not built by primitive people, even only based on the very size of the enormous megalithic blocks. That itself is enough. I don't know, can we even duplicate this? This site in Israel could be a transitional one from the typical Dirancuyo style underground cities to what I call elf castles, because it combines design elements from the both types. It's not clear if the elf castles builders were continuation of the civilization of the underground dwellers who cut the rock-cut cities, or did they simply find historic ruins and imitate their style or remodeled them? Vehicle tracks or something that looks like that seems to appear besides the elf castles, but sometimes they appear to be rather unusual. For example, at Belintash, yes, it looks like vehicle tracks, but it is just too short. It doesn't continue with some sort of equipment just moving. And here, did the stone melt and flow over one of the tracks? It is really not clear. Sometimes the tracks just turn into this type of markings on the stones. And then were the stones melting from something? Because here, as if they were molten when something hit. Maybe this melting explains this overflow here. The only similar thing I can think of are these, I don't know, tracks or what, in Bolivia. Also found besides rock cuttings that make little sense to us. So all those rock cut complexes in South America, like this one in Samaipata, and let's say the Baños de Inca, and then the Otusco windows, and this unidentified rock cut ruin in the middle of the ocean at Rapa Iti. Were they built by the people who made the elf castles, or do they belong to the later category of cuttings found near the famous megaliths in Peru? And it's not just the fact that huge megalithic blocks are found at the sites of the elf castles. There is yet another clue proving that they were built by advanced society, and that's the very fact that some of them are actually very large metropolises. It's impossible to even see where they end. It's just kilometers and kilometers of ruins showing here and there. That's valid especially for those of Bulgaria. And since very often medieval forts are built on the basis of such older structures, usually people would think that everything is medieval. Or in some cases where it is more obvious, they would be satisfied simply with the remark that it was built on the basis of an older place of worship or something like that. It would be like pagan place of worship, and people simply don't bother to think further. Like, for example, wait a minute, from what we are told about these so-called pagans, they shouldn't have been able to build such gigantic megaliths. They were simple folks, right? For example, a relatively insignificant fort in Austria. It is built on the top of older rock-cut ruins. They spread even outside the fortress compound, and they are obviously not cut for the purpose of the fort, because, for example, this is the outside of the defense walls. I'm sure you will agree that stairways are definitely not part of what would you expect on the outside, where you don't want your enemy to climb. And there is no lack of such examples. Turkey, Italy, Spain, they are full of them. We see them all the way to Switzerland and Austria even. At the Elf Castle places we see the first prototypes of the so-called Roman amphitheaters. And yet another one here, officially they're saying, we wonder, was it built by the Etruscans or by the Romans? This is a very commonly used trick used to distract us from inquiring into the real history, giving us two choices to wonder, and they're both misleading. Because both terms, Romans and Etruscans, are highly misused labels. In reality, they both signify almost the same, the society which was gradually degrading and losing the original knowledge. The examples of which we saw earlier, to use megalithic blocks the size of houses. But even if we stick to the penguinian terms of Roman and Etruscan, just look at it. Yes, the gate definitely looks Roman. It so obviously looks like a patch. Do we need to be specialists to see this? Fluted columns on the very ancient rock-cut ruins? Probably everything was there, nothing was invented by the so-called ancient Greeks or ancient Romans. The columns are labeled as Etruscan, and so the problem of explaining them is easily solved. But here I want to show you an Etruscan, what would be officially rock-cut tomb. This time it is in Turkey. And of course the credit to it is given to some primitive Turkish tribe that surely could not have afforded to go on package holiday to Etruria and over there borrow a sketch for their tomb. Otherwise, how come both have absolutely the same design, even the border matches? And it's not just one pair, there are hundreds if not thousands of such design all over the Asia Minor and Southern Europe. And that is why in the modern schools, history is taught always fragmented, just bit by bit, separately for every region, so that students are not shown images of the same sites occurring all over the world and on different continents. Otherwise they will figure out, look, it was all made by the same people. And I want to share just a small example of how such misleading labeling can be destructive to our understanding about history. We reached a small village in Spain where ancient vehicle tracks were supposedly found, but we didn't know the exact location within the village. So we started asking the villagers, and most of them didn't even know anything about them. We thought it's very weird because it was supposed to be kind of regional attraction, so how would you not know that it is in your own village? Ironically, at one point I was standing practically, 50 meters away from them, still I didn't know where they are, and I was asking somebody and he didn't know. And then he figured it out all of a sudden. He said, "Are you talking about the Roman car trucks?" And then we found them. This illustrates how much people get carried away by these official labels of the historic sites to the point that they don't even pay attention what is in front of their eyes. What we had at hand were very old ancient vehicle tracks. There was no ruin or any other hint around us to which culture would they belong to. And it always ultimately boils down to the same thing: faith, blind faith in what the history teacher told you. And blind faith means fanatic religion, it doesn't mean science. And the same with Atlantis. People are so brainwashed by the TV that this is some sort of legendary island, legendary meaning fantasy, non-existent, to the point that they don't want even to make themselves aware that there are whole lots of ruins staying there unexplored in the region of the Atlantic Ocean. And always, of course, there is some reason, supposedly trivial, as a rule, not to explore them. When any piece of ceramic with old looks is found in Europe and it can be labeled as a Roman, then thousands are spent on brushing it in the museums and keeping it tidy for the tourists when they come to visit. But when much more interesting ruins are found, Roman-looking ruins are found in America, always some local trivial reason will appear for stopping their study. Large system of ports lay submerged on the bottoms of the oceans around and in America. But very few people ask themselves why the History Mystery Bamboozle channel doesn't want to inform people about these amazing, in some cases, megalithic constructions on a very large scale. According to estimates, ports of this size and that many would be quite challenging to build even nowadays. Yet people believe that this type of folks built them. Ruins of similar style are found in the Bahamas, in South and North America as well. This is in Ecuador, although they are not submerged, the style is similar. And probably a nice way to close the chapter of the rock-cut ruins would be these absolutely massive rectangular pools, rock cut. As usual, nobody has got any clue as of their origin. Has somebody tried to study the local legends in relation to them? And Atlantis does not seem to be a product of somebody's fantasy after all, because the history of it has been preserved in the traditions on both sides of the ocean. It is in the codexes of the native nations in America. They even call it Aztlan. Even the name corresponds to the same island and same story that has been preserved in Europe. So in the Native American codexes, we have a record of people escaping a great flood and running to the mainland from Aztlan. And then on the other side in Europe, we have a legend. Of course, it has reached us maybe in a highly distorted form because it's from Plato. It means heavily edited, possibly before we get it. But the story and the name matches. And then in old chronicles from the region of nowadays Russia, we hear about this civilization then mixing with the locals, but they still kept the old name. It is clearly said that they were still calling themselves Aslanda. That's how the actual name is written without trying to translate it. And recently I noticed yet another place with traces of forgotten ancient civilization bearing the name of Aslantash. Tash is just an affix, like Belintash and many other Tashes, so when we remove it, it remains only Aslan. This is so close to Aslanda.
We don't have any confirmed dates about Atlantis, but from what we can gather so far, it might have met its end somewhere around 20 or 30,000 years ago.
There are no dates whatsoever for the rock-cut niches, platforms, terraces found all over from Japan to South America. On one hand, those of Europe appear to be actually of the style of elf castles. And yet in South America there appear to be a class, a type of their own found along the megaliths there. On the other side, the Peruvian cuttings appear to be very fresh, as if recently made. Well, maybe this can be explained with the dry climate over there. They got very well preserved, but then these in Sri Lanka, they are also relatively fresh, although not as fresh as the Peruvian ones. And at the same time, both of them seem to be much younger than the European ones, which are so heavily eroded in comparison to this. So were a couple of different civilizations or cultures cutting niches that we don't understand? And then the Sri Lankan ones appear to be pressed in the soft stone, or at least that is the visual impressions that some places give. While in Peru, definitely they look machine cut. Shame on us, maybe it's time to become aware that we know so little about our history. Look at this. We have even no clue why were they making stairs leading nowhere. And it's not just this set of stairs. There are thousands of such terraces and unknown things in Peru. In Peru, their amount is just overwhelming. And if in Sri Lanka softening of the stone was used to make them, then in Peru at places something like this could have been used to destroy them, because at the Sacsayhuaman site, where anyway we have some evidence that probably some sort of bomb fell in ancient times, well, over there some of the niches appear to be destroyed by melting. And it is very important that we see such cutting marks on solid bedrock, not just megalithic blocks. Because many of the so-called advanced ancient tool marks found on megalithic blocks could be actually made by simple tools when the mixture of the geopolymer was still soft, like these marks from Sacsayhuaman. But when we have tool marks with digital accuracy on large chunks, hills made of solid basalt or very hard variety of stone, then that is even more solid evidence of an advanced ancient civilization. It is also very interesting that whatever cut these niches, it was also polishing at the same time as it was cutting or scooping the rock. We don't know what exactly was it doing. We don't have such a technology nowadays. If we want to replicate this, first of all, we have to build a power plant next to it, because the machines that are needed for cutting and then polishing eat really a lot. And then we'll have to make special arrangements how to hang these machines or how to get them near the cliffs, because one thing is to achieve the effect on relatively small pieces that can be moved within the factories or the plants that work with stone. And when you can't just move the stone pieces around, that's another completely different situation. Gradually, man started building more and more megaliths, polygonal megaliths, instead of rock-cut stuff. The era of the polygonal megaliths was either very short or it was concentrated just at few separate spots around the globe, because there aren't that many of them. Contrary to the popular belief, it is not necessarily true that all of the polygonal gigantic megaliths are very old. First of all, many of them appear to be freshly made, like brand new. Almost no erosion whatsoever. This cannot be blamed just to the dry climate of Peru. This is in Peru as well, same conditions, but obviously it is much, much older. Another point to consider is that at few isolated spots, people knew how to build such polygonal wonders, megaliths, up to a short few hundred years ago, maybe some 200 years ago. This is a castle in Japan, medieval castle. In the Survivor series, you can see shown in detail similar examples from Russia and France as well. But I don't mean that all of them are recent. Here in Pumapunku, we see some very old stones sticking out of the modern renovation. All the older parts of Baalbek visibly seriously eroded. The builders of the enigmatic, polished, ancient big megaliths did not mysteriously disappear and evaporate as the earth prepared to descend into the dark ages of ignorance and wars that we are currently living through. As people were losing their knowledge, gradually the big megalithic blocks could not be handled anymore by them, and they started making something like big bricks. As they couldn't handle that anymore as well, they started using smaller and smaller bricks, usually cast out of geopolymer, but not always. Eventually, they resorted simply to undressed stone. The historic Khmer buildings in nowadays Myanmar, also called Cambodia, are probably the best preserved example of this gradual degradation. Also pay attention how the corner is formed by curved blocks. This is a very common approach also in Egypt and in Peru. They appear to have been cut after they have been placed, or they were molded together, something like that. So gradually that turns into smaller and smaller brick-like blocks. Please have a careful look. These are not yet our standard bricks. This is pure polygonal masonry yet, although the blocks are already almost brick size. Here we are still somewhere in between megaliths and bricks. And finally, the transition to the bricks as we know them is complete. And the legends, our true history, give a detailed account of how and why all this degradation happened. We see megalithic masterpieces scattered over different continents, and yet they look like as if they came from the hand of the same builder. Yes, it could have been the same builder who built Ollantaytambo and Alacayuk in Turkey, because this culture didn't have problem with intercontinental transport. They were advanced. Probably they were those who survived the destruction of Atlantis and continued whatever they could save from the old knowledge. Even as far as Australia, we see their signature. The extremely difficult polygonal stonework. The man who dismantled this wall from the Gympie Pyramid to relocate it could not even put it back together. The original stones fitted together with such precision that once taken apart, they could not be put together so well again, and they had to cut them a bit on the sides to put it together back again. But let's get back to the original builders. They were hunted down, they were at war with the enemies of mankind, and they were losing. They were losing the war badly, and also sudden climatic changes were upon the earth. Extreme climate appeared, probably then the poles froze, and they had to seek other places to live at. And then they started mixing with the uncivilized tribes that were inhabiting most of the earth. The tribes did accept them as their teachers and sometimes even gods. And it is these teachers that gave us everything that we call civilization. Have you noticed that always when we have these perfect, polished, precisely fitting, very big megaliths, usually we don't have carvings on them. All these designs and figures, they always come at the later stages when more recent cultures add them. This is Baalbek, before it was Peru, and here in Egypt. Not sure if the art was never there or it was destroyed, but we may have some curious, very old pieces of art in Turkey. It is a very peculiar and old style, and if it wasn't from the time of those teachers or gods, then they could be the earliest preserved examples of the art of the times when the teachers were starting to mix with the uncivilized tribes. Now, these ones are from Hattusha, but they belong to the older layers with the real polygonal masonry, not the Hittite Hattusha that you might have heard of. And a few more from Alacayuk. We don't have many pieces preserved in this style, although it is very interesting and peculiar. And then we have in Mykenä. They must have really respected it. Was it there or did they bring it from somewhere? They have put it as an emblem and built their whatever palace around it. Although it was already damaged piece when they brought it, you can see the heads are missing, and still they valued it so much that they put it as their most prominent antique already in their times, even maybe. Now, there are a couple of pieces also found in some Turkish museums, very few of them, and they're amongst other artifacts because officially they belong to, let's say, Hittite carvings or this style carvings, but this is completely different. It's not smooth, it's obviously different than the smooth statues we saw before.
On the other hand, the Hittites and so on probably based their art on those older smooth statues. Pieces like this being the examples of this transition.
The builders of the sophisticated polygonal megaliths also made lots of actually quite high-tech looking underground shafts, many of them megalithic. They're found in greatest concentration in Egypt. Almost every pyramid has an underground portion. And then the very few people who have seen the underground shafts in America describe them in the same manner. And they are definitely there in Teotihuacan, under Pumapunku, a large network below Cusco. Their existence is not denied, they're simply logged. We have one in Australia and a couple of them in Russia. And also in a couple of countries around Egypt, I believe Ethiopia and a supposedly Berber site in Sahara. And it seems that at all the places where we find advanced polygonal stonework, we also find elongated skulls. Some of them got studied and they don't appear to be fully human as well. And even when they look fully human, often they seem to be foreign to the area where they were found. For example, in South America, they would be red-haired. In Europe, it seems, according to legends, officially only legends, they would belong to foreigners who would somehow come and occupy always the governing positions. They would become kings, rulers, this type of people. And then we have another type of historic ancient ruins that sometimes it's even impossible to connect with any culture whatsoever. These are the stone quarries. These grottos from China are by far the most interesting example. They are vast, a full mountain is practically hollow. Here you can see the cutting marks compared to those of modern machines. And also this location at Crimea, very interesting. Tool marks that cannot be replicated by our most advanced and modern machines. And no clue who, when, why. And then we have a group of other quarries that could be connected to certain cultures, maybe, but they have their own sets of unanswered questions. Sierra de San Cristobal definitely being the most interesting out of them due to its enormous size. And all we can say in terms of dating at this point is that they seem to be younger than the rock-cut underground cities because those got eroded, although they're underground, but that's not much. We have another type of ruins that occur mostly in Asia, but also maybe in this European part here. Actually, there are a couple of dozens in this region. Officially, they belong to the Bronze Age era, but in reality, they're too high-tech for the way Bronze Age has been described to us. And also, this one, they started excavating, they covered it back. This one, Archaim, they tried to close down. This one, they submerged in a dam. And they seem to be connected with smelting metal. So most probably all this desire to avoid studying them could be connected with avoiding making it known to people that it was those gods and teachers Who taught the science of metallurgy to the simple tribal man? And it wasn't that long ago that we were sharing this planet with giants and tribes of dwarfs. Relatively well-preserved bones of giants are found practically all over the world. For example, in Sardinia, some elderly people still remember how they were taking out them from the nuraghe, never to be seen again. I always wonder if the nuraghe of Sardinia are somehow connected with the stone circles in South Africa. Not only both are circular, but also they both like windows. And then also Malta, it is known as the island of the giants. Well, modern school children are indoctrinated that those are just stupid legends. There were no giants at all. That's all fantasy, but to say that these giant megaliths were built by some absolutely primitive people who found some interesting mud that was turning very easily into stone and they built all these amazing things, that's more of a fantasy to me. If even uneducated people could make such durable and actually stylish, environmentally friendly buildings just putting mud together, then why are we killing Mother Earth, polluting it with our enormous cement industry, which is very poisonous, by the way, and still we can't make it to look that beautiful and so durable? And then the dwarfs managed to tolerate us even longer. We have much more artifacts and remains from them, and they're even still here now at some places underground. We have very tangible evidence from them in Central Asia, in Siberia. I put that in a special video, and then recently I visited Erdstelle. Sometimes they have rooms where we can fit, but they have such a tiny uh, living quarters and tunnels that I don't know how people don't connect them with dwarves. Although I did not meet any dwarfs personally during this visit, I think this hypothesis is really the best one because it's not just the passages and the doors of this size. The one we visited had a tunnel some 50-60 centimeters high and even more narrow, which went on for many meters, and my friend he started getting worried because he was always hoping we'll reach a wider place where he can turn back. He's 175 high and very slim, and he had difficulty crawling through it. These are some actual artifacts found in the dwarf abodes of Asia. And to get back to our visit to the Erdstall, the question arises, if a slim and not very tall man cannot even walk through the tunnels, cannot go through them, then how he can hit with a hammer and make them? It was impossible to take photographs even with the camera that we were holding in our hands in this situation. Movements were that much restricted. So to assume that a human of our size could have been hitting a hammer in this situation is absolutely ridiculous. And then I tried to discuss this point with a historian, a very lovely lady local to the area, but it was just like a wall immediately. Oh yes, we know about them. This is a mystery. This cannot be solved. This nobody knows. This penguin trick of the mystery, it really works very well. Once something is stamped as a mystery, any suggestion made about it, any hypothesis will be immediately considered fringe and aliens and nonsense and non-scientific by default, even if it is absolutely logical. So the case with the dwarfs perfectly illustrates how, let alone the legends, even some stories that are printed in the children's fairy tales books are much closer to the real history than some of the nonsense taught in schools. At the times when those gods or teachers who survived the destruction of Atlantis were educating and governing as well the planet, there was a lot of international and intercontinental travel going on. For example, in the Survivors episodes, we reviewed tangible presence of black people in Europe. Often they had respectable positions as nobles and governors. Then we had considerable African and European presence in both Americas and European presence in Australia and Africa. Those gods or teachers first were using the technique of casting, probably in the most cases, huge polygonal megalithic structures, and at later stages it turned into use of cement. This is a common sight at the old temples all over Southeast Asia, and that is a large chunk of the planet. Cement on the top of bricks. And then we have that very same cement used in Teotihuacan. It says extensive use, extensive. Few spots even survived the so-called restoration. That very same cement was used in Europe all the time, from Malta through the times we tend to call Roman, and then very few people actually pay attention that many of the medieval castles in Europe are cast out. But out of all historic figures, there is a single one most revered and most remembered. Jesus Christ. We don't even know how he looked like, or even when did he live. Although commonly believed that it was 2000 years ago, I personally find the Fomenko's version of 1000 years ago to be much more plausible. Well, that doesn't even matter, but it matters that we didn't manage to keep even a single original record of his actual teachings. But wars are like that, books are lost, the knowledge is forgotten. And this war seems to be going quite a few thousand years already. Entire cultures seem to be buried under sand, like for example Egypt. Villages and entire temple complexes are found under many meters of sand. Doesn't look like a natural process of formation of deserts when rivers drag and grind rocks into sand for millions of years. And then what about those terrible large-scale epidemic sicknesses? Were they really all natural or was it all engineered? And all those sites in Peru, Egypt and Turkey, where enormous megaliths are cracked and scattered around an epicenter, a typical aftermath of massive explosion. Well, most people prefer not to bother. They believe the teacher who told them that primates with spears caused all that, and they feel comfortable. Everybody else believes it as well. But for those who want to know the truth, even if not everybody believes in it, here is a very nice example. How can we find out the real history? It's not as difficult as you may think. Dmitry Nikulin is just a young lad from Belarus. His hobby is to research places of power. Now, from people who claim to have astral abilities, he has heard that they have visions around the lake of Svityaz. They have visions of a busy town, although it is just around all fields, and this lake suspiciously round. Now, the official explanation of the origin of this lake is that certain earth layers gave in into the cavities inside the earth. They basically fell down, and then a hole was formed, which later on filled in with water. The local legends tell a completely different story. They say that there was a town, city here, and these people, they had enemy, and when the enemies approached during war, the city started burning, and then it just fell into the ground, burned down, and then everybody who was touching the burned town also was getting sick and dying. Over there, he found a bunch of old maps, which were actually surprisingly accurate. All the lakes, all the towns were there, supposedly where they should have been, except this one, this lake that he was investigating. That was nowhere to be found. Instead of that, there was a town, a city, where it supposedly it should have been. And that's not in some faraway age of dinosaurs, just couple of 200-300 years ago. So why are they teaching these things in school? That in some far, far away age, when the face of the earth was forming, some layers fell down? No, it happened very recently, and the layers fell down because there was war. And think for yourself, what kind of weapon could make the city fall like immediately in the ground, and then whoever comes and touches it also gets sick and dies. And I'll give you a clue, this is not the only town and city that has disappeared under such a natural round crater, and high radiation levels can be still measured on some of them. And all this was happening some, let's say, 200 years ago. Even in America, there were very strange fires at that time, like flares of flames were jumping over lakes, turning, flipping over even trains. And then officially we are told that the crops were burning. What kind of crops burn like that? And why this distraction? What was the target? Actually, under the extremely misleading term of neoclassicism, lay in disguise the last remains of the old knowledge of those teachers or gods. It wasn't just a decoration style born of the sentiment of nostalgia for the old times. No, people still remembered somewhat the old times. That's why they knew how to build those amazing polygonal megaliths. In the Survivor series, I have provided detailed examples for that with the megaliths of St. Petersburg and the aqueducts of France. Also, the megalithic pieces from Japan that we saw earlier, they are part of a star fort, not something extremely ancient. Some of the engineering masterpieces of that time are of quality higher than what we have nowadays. The star forts were built by people who still understood the practical meaning of sacred geometry. People who still felt to some extent the pulse of their mother, the nature, Earth. And then the last few remaining molecules of that knowledge were lost during the times of so-called Industrial Revolution. I can't put it in better words than Jane Roberts did in her Seth books. That's why I will simply include a quote from her book.
In Western culture, since the Industrial Revolution, after about 1760, the idea grew that there was little connection between the objects in the world and the individual. Now this is not a history book, so I will not go into the reasons behind this idea, but will merely mention that it was an overreaction, in your terms at least, to previous religious concepts. Before that time, man did believe that he could affect matter and the environment through his thoughts. With the Industrial Revolution, however, even the elements of nature lost their living quality in man's eyes. They became objects to be categorized, named, torn apart, and examined. You do not dissect a pet cat or dog to love it. So when man began to dissect the universe, in those terms he had already lost his sense of love for it. It became soulless for him. Only then could he examine it, you see, without qualm, and without being aware of the living voice that protested. And so in his great fascination for what made things work, in his great curiosity to understand the heredity of a flower, say. He forgot what he could also learn by smelling a flower, looking at it, watching it be itself. So he examined dead nature. Often he had to kill life in order, he thought, to discover its reality. You cannot understand what makes things live when you must first rob their life. And so when man learned to categorize, number, and dissect nature, he lost its living quality and no longer felt a part of it. To some important extent he denied his heritage. For spirit is born into nature and the soul, and for a time resides in flesh. Man's thoughts no longer seemed to have any effect upon nature because in his mind he saw himself apart from it. In an ambiguous fashion, while concentrating upon nature's exterior aspects in a very conscious manner, he still ended up denying the conscious powers of his own mind. He became blind to the connection between his thoughts and his physical environment and experience. Nature became then an adversary that he must control. Yet underneath he felt that he was at the mercy of nature, because in cutting himself off from it, he also cut himself off from using many of his own abilities. It was at this point that the nature of the conscious mind itself became so misunderstood, and those unrecognized or denied powers were assigned to unconscious portions of the self by ensuing schools of psychology. There have been tyrannies propagated for various reasons by the race of man upon itself. One of the greatest, however, is the idea that the conscious mind does not have any touch with the fountains of its own being, that it is divorced from nature, and that the individual is therefore at the mercy of unconscious drives over which he has no control. Man, therefore, feels himself powerless. If the purpose of civilization is to enable the individual to live in peace, joy, security, and abundance, then that idea has served him poorly.
The Star Forts appeared on the stage of history relatively recently, yet here we see one buried under layers of earth, as if the great flood was upon it. I agree that it could have been some local violent landslide that caused all this if it was just an isolated case. But around that time, we also see areas of Siberia having their forest devastated, and that's in spots larger than entire countries. No mention about it in any chapter of the official history. And who is there to mention it when even the graves of the people at that time seem to have disappeared? After I published the material on why entire cities built in neoclassical style are also buried under such thick layers of clay, then I received a lot of response from all over the world. People on the Balkans, in Hungary, Budapest, and couple of cities even in America reported the same thing. Entire quarters of towns built in neoclassical style are buried 1-2 stories below earth, and there is no explanation and often even no mention about it in the official history records. So if mankind is gullible enough to forget things that happened 200 years ago, do you really expect that the history of 1000 or couple of thousand years ago will be correct? Before finding out its true history, humanity will first of all need to cultivate courage, because lots of it will be needed for people to honestly face the fact that they have lived most of their lives based on wrong concepts. It will be psychologically very painful for many, because once we start delving into the question of who and why tempered without history, what was the force that through the ages, from the Reformation till nowadays, manages to keep the secrets of the true history with such a persistence? Why is that so important? Many will simply give up the inquiries into this matter when they start touching the area that it's not just the history, our full current reality is a fake one, imposed upon humanity in the form of a fake belief system.